Thank you for joining us today. This is Bill Baker. I'm sorry for the technical difficulties that we had here, but I believe that we are now alive and well. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar that is co-sponsored and underwritten by the Rochester Business Alliance. This is part of the Crisis Coach series of webinars that is presented in conjunction with Firestorm. We invite you to visit Firestorm and become our friend on Facebook at Firestorm Solutions. You can follow us at Twitter at Firestorm Soul. And the hashtag for this crisis session is hashtag Crisis Coach. Firestorm transforms crisis into value, and we empower you to manage business risks and crises. We have expertise in crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communication, crisis public relations, and consequence management. We invite you also to visit us at firestorm.com and become our regular visitor there. The presentation today is not complete without accompanying oral comments and discussion, and the work product that we're providing today must be read in conjunction with all guidance given by your organization's personal counsel. The information given should not be interpreted as legal advice or legal opinion. The Rochester Business Alliance and Firestorm are pleased to present the Crisis Coach webinar series. Our topic today is workplace violence. And we have one of our experts, the chairman, Chief Executive Officer and co-founder Harry Rulin will be making the presentation. The webinar series is underwritten by the Rochester Business Alliance, and I'd like to turn it over to Chip Dawson. Chip, go ahead.
Thank you, Bill, and good morning. Welcome to the 6th in the series of the Crisis Coach for all of you attending. The Rochester Business Alliance is delighted to partner with Firestorm to bring you, our members, this critical 45-minute discussion by Firestorm Chairman and CEO Harry Rulin covering the subject of workplace violence. Harry is new to the RBA audience, but not to the topic. He has years of experience helping employers deal with violence issues that we only know about from the evening news. He also has a strong link to our area with degrees in law and business from Syracuse University. You'll hear Harry mention this morning the data on how big a problem violence in the workplace has become. From bullying to multiple homicides, thousands of cases occur every day. Historically, employers have assumed that law enforcement will deal with it, but that's not the case. Unless you are fully prepared to deal with workplace violence, the event will be over and your organization will be breaking news long before you hear sirens in the distance. As you listen to Harry today, think about the actions you might take to avoid getting into a crisis situation. And when the program is over, contact us to talk about how we might help you with those actions. Now, here's Harry.
Thanks, Chip. And actually, before the webinar got started, Bill, Chip, and I had a little opportunity to talk about workplace violence and some of the statistics surrounding it. And it is a somewhat interesting and daunting in some way task for organizations to try and deal with the whole concept of workplace violence. Workplace violence, as Chip said, happens every day around the country. As a matter of fact, on average, there's somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 to 2 workplace shootings a day. One of the reasons you don't hear about them necessarily in your area is because they're covered by the media geographically. But it is by far one of the highest risks to employees, and believe it or not, it is the highest risk of death to women in the workplace. Typically, and you'll hear as I go further on in the presentation, that is normally as a result of spouses, boyfriends, or others with whom the women have relationships, bringing those problems to the workplace. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. You know, one of the things that we like to do in these webinars before we get started is give a little bit of an update. And interestingly, when talking about the subject of workplace violence, all of the headlines have an impact. So for example, the winter storms this year. The winter storms have been huge around the country. We've had tremendously cold temperatures. resulted in lots of damage to homes and other things. Well, keep in mind, all of that pressure, all of those problems that people have at home, pipes bursting, all kinds of other issues, the cold, their cars not working, all that, that creates stress. And stress in the environment comes into the workplace. They show up at work after they were up all night dealing with those issues. It just creates more and more workplace-related problems. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we deal with those, ways of addressing that, making sure that we're providing our employees the assistance that they need so that they don't bring their issues to their coworkers and to your business. We have unfortunately seen an unprecedented number of shootings already this year, both in the workplace and in schools. I know that members of the Rochester Business Alliance, quite a few of you, are universities, secondary schools, things of that nature. So we do talk a bit about schools and school shootings, but the thing I want everyone to remember when we do talk about that is that even if you're not a school, all of the media pressure that gets put on these school shootings where people are seeing it continuously creates a psychological situation where people who are sitting on the fence wondering if they should act or if they should do something, it tends to push them over. So we need to be very careful about those kind of things. The data breaches, I know a lot of you are concerned about that with your own data, but also keep in mind that when data breaches occur with millions and millions of people, a lot of those are your employees or your customers. And again, that creates stress within the system. I don't know whether a lot of you have noticed, but communicable illness, which is something that Firestorm tracks on a daily, actually on a continuous basis, is very much on the rise. Some of the diseases that we were very concerned about a couple of years ago, such as the H5N1 flu virus, is still continuing to kill people on a daily basis. There's a new one, the H7N9. There are several, as you probably heard recently on the news, new viral infections that they're attributing to bats and other animals that are very scary because they're extremely virulent. They kill almost everyone they come in contact with, and they spread very easily human to human. So your communicable illness planning needs to be implemented very carefully within your organization, knowing what those triggers are and when you're going to pull those triggers, because they have a direct impact, as you can imagine, on your overall workplace violence planning as well. So that being said, I think it is very important to remember that every crisis is a human crisis. There's no question that the new norm, workplace violence is just part of the environment that you exist in, and you need to make sure you develop the appropriate plans for addressing it. And I think you need to remember that the real key to addressing it is your people. We're going to talk about behavioral risk and threat assessment. That is such a key factor for almost every organization. Knowing how and what to do when you recognize the warning signs. So how to recognize the warning signs and what to do about them is just key to making sure that the person doesn't continue to ramp up within your business environment. You know, the last thing any of us want is to see this piece of yellow tape around our business. I mean, by the time the police respond, the damage to your people, to your structure, and to your brand and reputation, because of course what happens in today's world is by the time this tape goes up, it's already out there. Twitter, Facebook, all the social media. There's no way that you can any longer continue to control your message. So workplace violence, while it's a horrific thing for your people, can also be completely damaging to your organization and its reputation. So we'll talk more about that. There's a couple of business professors at Harvard who wrote a book called Predictable Surprises. And in there, one of the things they say is that almost every incident of workplace violence was preceded by a warning signal. And I think that we all know that. We look back and we go, yeah, you know, I knew Charlie had lost his wife, and you know, he was acting really strange. He was sitting in the lunchroom by himself. He used to be such a friendly guy. Well, all of those things are warning signs. And if we knew how to recognize them and we knew what to do with that information, the chance that we could help Charlie and make sure that we don't have these kind of situations is so much greater. So I really encourage all of you to look at how robust your workplace violence plan, training, and education is. What does your behavioral risk and threat assessment process look like? Do you have a team in place who knows how to analyze those things? Very important for every business, regardless of size. You know, when I say a team, you know, if you only have 10 employees, your team may be 2 or 3 people. But we can talk that all through with you, and it's very, very important. Probably one of the most important things you could do in terms of avoiding violence within your workplace. So as you can see, these are statistics from 2010, but if you look at them on any given year, they're about the same. The number of people killed in the workplace varies between 450 and 600 on pretty much any given year. In the schools, you know, one of the things, in spite of the fact that workplace violence happens so much more frequently, as I indicated earlier, the schools make the headlines because, of course, the worst terror any parent could ever imagine is their kid being involved in a school place shooting. These are the statistics that your business sort of exists in terms of school shootings and seeing it on the TV. And of course, keep in mind, when there's somebody within your organization who sees that intense coverage that the school shootings are receiving, the fact that you're not a school doesn't matter. Psychologically, it pushes them all over the edge. So we had 11 shootings. Now, this is a statistic that hasn't been updated yet for this month, but as of the end of last month in 2014. And as you can see, that's more than we've had in some entire years. And of course, already in the first 4 years of this decade, we've had double what was in any previous decade. So the intense media coverage, I believe, and I attribute to the fact that we're seeing a tremendous escalation. This is a statistic that's always interested me, that we have approximately the same number of bullies and bullying situations that we have workplace violence situations in the United States. I think it's a coincidence, but one of the things I would ask anybody is, where do those bullies go after they graduate from school? Those are the same people who are in your workforce. Those are the same people who have had problems in the past that maybe they grew out of, or maybe they're just latent in their personality, that when something does go wrong at home or in some other situation, that those tendencies come out. So I think it's very important, again, to understand the behavioral risk issues that are associated with having a large group of employees. One of the things we find in terms of workplace shooters, you know, I indicated earlier that very often it's in terms of when women are shot, it's men coming into the workplace, husbands, boyfriends, things of that nature. But also, overwhelmingly, it is men in the workforce. So when we're doing our behavioral risk, our threat analysis, when we're setting up our programs, there is a reason to focus more on your male population. Similarly, in schools, one of the things that we've seen, and this is an important statistic, that 75% of them felt bullied. So keep in mind that it's not necessarily the bully that becomes your workplace violence problem. It's the person that that bully is bullying who feels the need to come back and seek some type of retribution. And unfortunately, 2/3 of them have never been in any kind of trouble, so they're not necessarily the ones that you're looking for. So again, understanding where to see and how to find those clues, those behavioral characteristics that allow you to predict who's going to be in trouble and who's going to cause trouble is very important. Now, I want to point to the bottom of this page as well. You'll see that in 80% of the time there's leakage. Leakage is the term that law enforcement uses to say that somebody knew that the perpetrator was going to do something. And 66% of the time, at least 2 people knew. Well, if people know and we give them a good avenue for reporting and an understanding that it is their obligation under the same sort of thought process that Homeland Security is now going through with the if you see something, say something program, that same kind of thing needs to exist within your workplace. People need to know how to report and the fact that we want them to report. So if you know that Johnny's wife left him last night and that he was out drinking all night, that's a great thing to go and tell the Human Resource Department. That doesn't mean that Johnny's going to get in trouble. That doesn't mean that means we're going to have the opportunity to help. And I think that we've got to give employees a way to do those things anonymously and make sure that they don't feel there's going to be any retribution against them. So I'm not going to go through all of the detail on all these slides, but you can certainly request this information and we'd be happy to share it with you. But you can see there are a lot of statistics surrounding why workplace violence occurs, why the deaths that take place in the workplace, who's perpetrating them, who are the victims, is it done, what's the methodology that's used. That information's all out there, and it's very important for your team, your behavioral risk and threat assessment team, as well as your overall employee base to understand. There are statutes in every state. There are federal statutes where workplace violence has been identified as a hazard, and therefore there's a requirement that each of you have taken steps to plan for and mitigate those exposures. There are many legal issues that arise in terms of your responsibilities to keep your employees safe. There's no question that an employer has an obligation to do so, and that the employees have certain rights to expect that it's being done. You know, obviously, OSHA, in every one of these workplace violence situations, whether it's a workplace homicide or ordinary workplace violence, and we'll talk a little bit more as I go further on about things that are considered to be workplace violence. And you'll be surprised. You know, obviously, it's easy to say that a workplace homicide is violence, but is an off-color joke workplace violence? Well, in some situations, it's been deemed that way. And there are lots of laws and rules and regulations surrounding this that can affect you as an employer. So it's very important that you understand them and that, again, you've got the right protections in place. Also, discussing this with your general counsel or with your outside counsel, very much worth doing. There was a disturbing holding in a case recently in Arizona where they deemed that a corporation could be held criminally liable. Now, of course, that doesn't make a lot of sense to many of us that are attorneys because it's difficult to hold a non-human to a human standard because typically criminal liability requires that there be intent. But in this case, and there'll be a lot more going on around this case and others like it, but this is a standard that is going to be very much in the news, or very much in the legal news anyway, for some time to come. Just something to be aware of. So I was just indicating earlier, you know, we would talk a little bit about what constitutes workplace violence. Well, psychological violence, intimidation, harassment, obscene phone calls, threats, all of those things are deemed to be workplace violence. Clearly, physical interaction between employees, I don't think we need to talk about the fact that that's workplace violence. They occur regularly. You know, so we regularly see shootings, rapes, fights, stabbings, suicides, that kind of thing in the workplace. And it's very important that we have the planning, the process, the procedure in place to make sure that those things are mitigated to the greatest extent possible. I indicated earlier that spillover of violence from home. Now, spillover doesn't necessarily just have to be from violence. Again, it can be from any stressor in the home, but if you do have people that have a violent home life, that is something that you definitely want to be aware of. We spoke about stressful events, inefficient protection programs. One of the things that you definitely want to have in place is an understanding of are there employees who have restraining orders, for example, against their spouses? Have you put in place appropriate protections for those people? There's absolutely a requirement that an employer know that information And if you do have an employee who has a restraining order or a non-custodial parent kind of situation in the school environment, your front desk people need to know. Your front desk people need to know, what do I do if this person shows up? They need the training and the education to be able to diffuse the situation, because those situations turn ugly very quickly and they don't normally go well. So that's something that when you're creating your workplace violence program and plan, I very much encourage you to include in that the process and procedure for your employees to notify you of those legal type of situations. And having the fourth one here, lack of an appropriate formal behavioral risk assessment process and follow-up. You've heard me say it already. I'm going to stress it again. Your people need to be trained. There needs to be a group who can take the appropriate steps when early notification has been given, or any notification, but obviously we're hoping it's as early and as quickly as possible. Obviously there's a wide spectrum of behaviors that constitute workplace violence. We want to catch them early when they are those behaviors of concern which I was just referring to. So how do we combat workplace violence? Well, those of you who've worked with Firestorm before and who have been on these webinars know that we follow a very simple formula, which is predict, plan, perform. If we can predict, as we can here, the vulnerability and the exposure, then we know what it is we're planning for and what we're trying to prevent. In our planning stage, certainly if we can identify potential aggressors or victims and implement viable solutions, the likelihood is that we're going to prevent something from occurring which could have been horrific for our people and for our organization. So, do you understand the threats and vulnerabilities? Certainly if you've done vulnerability and threat analysis for your organization, you do. And if you understand the makeup of the people who are in your workforce, you do. So we need to recognize and accept that there is a risk. I think, this is sort of almost with any type of situation where we're doing something which we're unfamiliar with or with which we're uncomfortable with, recognizing and accepting that the risk exists is so important. Then we can move on from there. I indicated earlier that there were warning signs that everybody needed to be aware of. Clearly, I'm not going to try today to do a complete training for you on the behavioral warning signs of things that you should be looking for in your employees and that your fellow employees should be looking for and know how to report. But this is the kind of training you definitely want to put in place for your people. Once you do have a situation, absolutely knowing how to assess it, having a team who can assess it, being aware again of employees who might pose a threat. Obviously, if you have someone who's showing those behavioral warning signs, we want to get them help immediately. If you've got an EAP, if you've got other type of options available where you can provide an employee with assistance, it's so important that we do that. When we talk about behavioral warning signs, keep in mind there are also various levels. So there are very high tier 1 type of risks where if somebody's showing that kind of aggression, you're going to deal with it immediately. Sometimes you're going to deal with it by dialing 911. I mean, it gets to that point. There are other lower risk behaviors. And again, we want our human resource people and everyone to some degree within the organization to know what those are and have the ability to know what to do. How do I report this? Who do I tell? How do I make sure that this doesn't turn into a tier 1 or an actual event? So again, the training, the education, I can't stress it enough. Tier 1 behaviors, once you've got someone in that situation, someone who's exhibiting signs that they need assistance, this is the kind of thing we cannot allow to be swept under the rug. Normally we in the United States have said, oh, Johnny will be okay. It's just, he lost his wife, he lost, his parents, whatever it might be. Yeah, he's stressed and he's not behaving the way that he should, but who would in that situation? Well, you're right, who would? But that doesn't mean that we don't have an obligation to make sure that he gets the assistance that he needs so that it doesn't become a bigger problem for everybody. One of the things we also want to look at is the problem on the increase or the decrease? I mean, we all have issues that occur within our lives. Let's say I got in a car accident yesterday, but I'm okay with it. I've dealt with it. The insurance is handling it. I've got my rental car. My issue is not escalating. We need to really keep the escalation in our view, because if somebody is ramping up, we want to know it. So again, now, we talked about the predictive aspects. Now the question is, what's the plan? Do we have identified policies? Have we created a workplace violence plan? Does everyone understand the process, the reporting protocols? I've talked to you about having an anonymous reporting type of process. Sometimes organizations do that by text message, by email, giving people a tool where they can report where it never comes back to them. Do we have people in our organization who can do an investigation, who know how to address or mitigate the threats? It's really the planning, the process, and the procedure is what's going to determine how well your organization and its people, keep in mind this is all about people. How do we come out of this? Very important. You've heard me harp on this issue, the behavioral risk and threat assessment. Nothing can be more important. Putting in place this planning and training for your people, this will avoid so many problems. When we're looking at those behaviors, a lot of times, when we talk about direct threats are the kind of things where we may actually be calling 911. I mean, if we're in a situation where somebody is in the building with a gun, somebody is already taking action, we may very well be having to take action ourselves as a corporation. Sometimes we have indirect threats. If somebody's just mad and they scream, I'm going to kill somebody. Well, that's not a direct threat against any individual. So knowing how to recognize those, knowing what they mean and what we're going to do about it before they ever occur is so important. There are various threat levels, as I mentioned earlier. We need to train and educate your people as to what these are. Certainly, again, I can't go through all these with you today, but this is the type of information when we do your threat training for your people on your workplace violence plan. These are the kind of things we'll go through in detail. We'll do test exercises. We'll let them see in a simulated environment what it feels like to try and address these things. And then, of course, it comes down to your performance. On the performance side, the training, the education, the implementation when the time comes, the ability to respond. Can't stress how important this is. The training and the education, I mean, if we just have a book on a shelf, if that workplace violence plan is the greatest plan in the world, but we've never trained and educated our people on what to do with it, that's a real problem. And that's common in America today and in the workforce. We do a lot of good work, and then it sits on a shelf because it doesn't become part of the culture of the organization. Making these things culturally part of the organization is so important. Incident response and training, can't stress enough, you've got to do simulated exercises. The training has to happen. The involving law enforcement, emergency medical, people like that in your training exercises, making sure your team members know how to do the proper investigations. Very often, if you're in a large corporation, you'll have some type of either internal security person or sometimes a law enforcement individual on your team. And having that type of capability integrated into the team provides tremendous skills and a very significant ability to respond where previously you would not have been able to. So we try to maximize your outcome in not just the overall process, but in each given phase. So again, on the predictive side, you need to do all that work up front, understand what your exposures are. On the planning side, if you need assistance with your policy document, one of the things that your workplace violence plan is going to need, it's going to need to reside within your overall preparedness framework. But you need a policy. You need to have a statement that's gone out to all of your people, and everyone understands that it's a zero tolerance within our organization. We are going to take these kind of things seriously. And then when it comes time to perform, we've got to have the prevention in place. We've got to have the training in place. We've got to be regularly making it part of the culture of our organization to prevent these things from happening. Now, one of the things, as a result of the Rochester Business Alliance relationship that Firestorm has, we will do the business continuity and workplace violence self-assessment that we normally charge for. We will do that for you free of charge. And I very much recommend, if you want to know where your organization currently stands in terms of its workplace violence planning, training, and education, as well as how that might affect your overall business survival in the event of an occurrence, I would very much encourage all of you to take that self-assessment. It takes about an hour. We walk you through a series of questions, and from that we will develop a report for you, which you can then use to assess where are you, where do we need to improve, is there anything that we need to do so that we feel we've done the job that needs to be done on the workplace violence planning, training, and education. Also, I think what that does is it gives you an opportunity to practice continuous improvement, because I think that's really where all of these preparedness initiatives wind up. You always want to be doing better. There's no organization that has the perfect setup for workplace violence, business continuity, emergency response, any of the pieces that reside within your preparedness framework. So the more we can be doing to continuously improve in all those areas, the better off we're going to be. It really needs to become a part of your culture moving forward. So that said, again, do not hesitate to contact us. Whether you go on our website and get more information or call the 800 number that is on your screen at the moment. Bill Baker, who set up this webinar, who, by the way, Bill, thank you very much, is always available. And I think, Bill, that being said, do we have any questions or comments that any of our listeners have made? Anything we need to address?
We do not, Harry. Thank you for a thorough presentation today.
Well, it was my pleasure. And Chip, I don't know if you want to make any comments.
Just to thank you, Harry. We really appreciate the information, and clearly this is a problem of a scope that's much greater than I think an awful lot of people realize. And thank you for pointing that out to us today. And we'll look forward to the next webinar.
Well, I think you're exactly right. I mean, and I don't think we need to necessarily view it as so much as a problem as it's just part of the environment that we exist in. And that's true in Rochester as much as it is in any other city or town around the country. So we're happy to do it, and if there's anything more we can do to assist the members of your alliance, we are standing by ready to do so.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Harry. Bye.
Thank you, Bill.